Professor Pitney is the Roy P. Crocker Professor of Politics at CMC. He really needs no introduction, and I know we need to get right to the commentary. So Professor Pitney, a huge thanks for being with us today, and thank you for all that you do for CMC. I turn it over to you.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Evan. The title for today's talk is based on something I have frequently said to my children in recent months that you'll tell your grandchildren about these days. And particularly relevant because my son, in addition to being my son, is also a prospect. And yes, I am old enough to have a son who is applying to colleges. So something that we've talked a lot about in recent days. And as Evan said, we're all looking forward to being live again. A couple of weeks ago, you may have seen Peggy Noonan's column in the Wall Street Journal, in which he quoted a professor friend who said that he was sick of being Max Headroom and wants to become Mr. Chips again. Well, that was me. So looking forward to being live, seeing a lot of you in person again, seeing lots of familiar faces, so many familiar faces. I'm tempted to check whether some of you still owe me papers, but that's another issue entirely. Okay, so let me cut to the chase and go to my shared screen. Okay, and the topic is, you will tell your grandchildren about these days. And what has prompted me to use this line with my kids is that there are so many things going on that really don't have any clear parallel in living memory. The most obvious thing is the pandemic. We had a pandemic before. We've had other pandemics. There was one in 1968. In hindsight, I think I caught it. Then it wasn't nearly as serious as COVID, but it did spread around the world. That was so-called Hong Kong flu. The clearest parallel is pretty much out of living memory, the 1918 to 20 Great Influenza. The interesting thing, if you look at the history of that, unlike the current pandemic, wasn't really a political issue at all, or at least not a national political issue. Woodrow Wilson never said a single word in public about the Great Influenza, even though it cost 675,000 deaths in the United States. And if you look at the population of the United States at the time, that proportionately far, far, far more deadly than COVID-19. But he never said a word about it in public. And in fact, it's very likely that he got it when he was in Versailles for the negotiations after the First World War. And it's likely that his bout with the influenza aggravated his ongoing neurological problems and led to his stroke. But that's another issue entirely. The Great Influenza did have some parallels to the present. They closed the house public galleries. In some places, they closed other kinds of public gatherings. There were, in fact, slackers. We talk about people today declining to wear their masks. And of course, there we go. This is from more than 100 years ago. Mask slackers, people talking about deadly spit. And a lot of the things we're talking about today, social distancing, check, masks, check, cleaning of surfaces, check. But the big difference was not a national political issue. One, Wilson just didn't want to talk about it. It started in the closing days of the First World War, and some of it was due to wartime censorship. They didn't want to hurt homeland morale. Some of it was just the expectations of what the federal government could do. Remember, this was well before the New Deal, and people just didn't expect as much of the federal government as they do today. So it wasn't really a kind of national issue that we see today. So that's one big difference, something that we will talk about. Perhaps our grandchildren will live in an age where there are much more effective antivirals and the notion that people had to socially distance, lock down, wear masks will seem very distant. So we'll tell our grandchildren about these days, and like grandchildren throughout all of human history, they will not pay attention. But that's an issue that we can deal with in decades to come. Of course, another big difference is the person who just left office. And there are a number of ways in which Trump is very different from previous presidents, departure from history. A few data. In 2016, he lost the popular vote by a larger raw vote margin than anybody in American history. Hillary Clinton won the popular vote in 2016. She did not win the electoral vote. And in 2020, Trump got another place in history, the first president since Benjamin Harrison to lose the popular vote twice in a row. Okay, trivia question. What state was Benjamin Harrison from? And Jack Stark, I'm looking in your direction. What state was Benjamin Harrison from? Okay, I think the answer was
Hey, Helen. I think it's Indiana, isn't it?
Indiana. Yes, that is absolutely right. Okay.
Good for you. I mean, you're so smart.
That is true. First president since Benjamin Harrison to lose the popular vote twice in a row. Haven't had that in a long time. 2016, foreign interference. A lot of debate in the Mueller report over whether there was actual collusion between the Trump campaign and Russia, and that ended inconclusively, but there were a couple of episodes that, to put it mildly, are disturbing. First, Trump openly invited foreign interference, and I'll spare you my Trump imitation. Russia, if you're listening, I hope you're able to find the 30,000 emails that are missing. And within hours of him saying that, the Russian military did exactly that through their cutout in WikiLeaks. And his campaign chair, Paul Manafort, shared inside campaign information with a Russian agent, a fellow named Konstantin Kalinick. And this isn't from the Mueller report, by the way. It's from the report of the U.S. Senate Intelligence Committee, a bipartisan report. So there's not any real controversy about the factual basis of that statement. So this is highly unusual for this level of connection between presidential campaign and foreign adversary. Certain issues have come up in the past, and of course, in the case of the Mueller report, a lot of back and forth about the meaning of collusion and conspiracy and all the rest. But these two things are not really in serious dispute. Recently, he became the first president whom the House impeached twice. In 2019, for pressuring Ukraine to release dirt on Biden, and most recently for the Capitol insurrection. And this is extremely unusual to impeach a president in the final days of his tenure. And the Senate trial will occur sometime in the next few weeks. And you may wonder, can a president be impeached after he has left office? And the answer is there is a precedent for impeaching a public official after that official has left office. And that was Secretary of War William Belknap. And if you are a reader of USA Today, you may have seen a recent article by Andra Belknap, a direct descendant of the impeached Secretary of War and a Pitzer alum and a former student of mine. So there is a precedent for impeaching an official who's left office. Could be some very interesting constitutional discussions about that. And so that gets us to the Capitol insurrection, which we all witnessed. We don't have to go into a great deal of detail about that. You saw the video, both on the day that it occurred and in the days to follow. And we're learning more and more about what happened. The important thing here is, in terms of what we will tell our grandchildren it was the first large-scale breach of the Capitol since the War of 1812. There have been other incidents, specifically in the 1950s. A small group of Puerto Rican terrorists entered the House chamber, fired gunshots, and the bullet holes are still there. Bullet holes are still there from that incident. But it wasn't anywhere near on the scale of what happened on January 6th. There you literally have to go back to the War of 1812 to find anything of that magnitude. Well, what is the larger significance of this about what we're witnessing in our age? Key term here is what might be called aversive partisanship. And that is, people are lining up in the two parties, not necessarily just because of what people in each party believe, but because of hostility to people in the other party. And the insurrection at the Capitol was perhaps the most dramatic illustration of that concept. But it's not just a vague meme that you see on social media. It's a phenomenon that has been well documented in public opinion research. Here's a datum, and you can click the link at your leisure to go back and look at the academic research. 42% of Republicans and Democrats view the other party as, quote, downright evil. That's not a paraphrase. That is the actual phrasing in the survey question. 42% agree. If you're a Republican, 42% agree that Democrats are downright evil, and an equal percentage of Democrats say that of Republicans. Now, we don't have directly comparable survey data, but this is obviously higher than it has been in recent years. It's not entirely without parallel. You can go back to the Civil War era, and if you'd had public opinion polling at that time, you probably would have gotten similar results, maybe a couple of other points in American history, but still something very, very unusual. More detail, each party viewing itself and the other. Now, this is from Pew Research, is the Democratic Party trying to make capitalism work, or has it been taken over by socialists? Strong majority of Republicans say Democratic Party's been taken over by socialists. And an equally large percentage of Democrats say, well, they're just trying to make capitalism work for the average American. This is related to the first one about downright evil, because remember, a lot of Americans associate socialism not with Denmark and Sweden, but with Cuba and Venezuela. They liken socialism to communism, and they associate it with authoritarian regimes. So that adds to the level of polarization and hard feeling. Conversely, perception, Republican Party is trying to protect the American way. Vast majority of Republicans agree with that. The opposite interpretation, the Republican Party has been taken over by racists. 80% of Democrats agree with that. So if you're a Republican, you're confronting Democrats who think your party has been taken over by racists. If you're a Democrat, you are confronting a party who thinks that your party has been taken over by socialists. This is not a formula for constructive debate and dialogue, to put it mildly. Domestic enemies. This is just brand new. This is just a couple of days ago on YouTube. And as you can see here, vast majority of people in both parties and independents think the biggest threat to America's way of life is people in this country and domestic enemies. And the data we just looked at suggests that people in each party think of those domestic enemies as people in the other party. Again, this helps us understand some of the things that have been going on in recent days and the things that we'll be telling our children about. All of this relates to the differences between the parties. Some of you took my parties class. These data might be familiar to you, but it's worth noting that the two parties are well sorted. That is, one kind of person is in the Republican Party, another kind of person is in the Democratic Party. Very different from the way it used to be. As a lot of you know, I grew up in the state of New York, and for a long time, the only governor I could remember was Nelson Rockefeller. And Nelson Rockefeller was a fairly liberal Republican, probably to the left of a lot of Democrats. And our senator, the first person I ever cast a vote for Senate, was a fellow named Jacob Javits. His voting record, again, far to the left of most Republicans, in fact, to the left of a lot of Democrats. Conversely, he had a lot of fairly conservative Democrats, particularly, but not exclusively, in the South. That's not true anymore. You don't have liberal Republicans anymore, really, to speak of, not in the same sense as Jacob Javits. You don't have a lot of conservative Democrats. The closest you have is maybe somebody like Joe Manchin, who's kind of dead center in voting. And you see this in the parties, particularly because in the South, a lot of white people migrated to the Republican Party over the past few decades. So the parties are pretty well sorted. The Democratic Party is a party of liberals and progressives. The Republican Party is a party of conservatives. Not much of the twain shall meet. And demographically, the parties are quite different. The Republican Party is today primarily a party of white people without college education. 57% of Republicans and Republican leaners are white people without college educations. Only 30% of Democrats meet that description. Now, this is very different from the way it used to be as late as the 1990s. In the 1990s, the demographic profiles of the party weren't all that radically different. And it changed a lot since then. Now, the Democratic Party, a party of college-educated white people, African Americans, Latinos, Asian Americans. Some people in those groups are in the Republican Party, but predominantly Democratic. So the parties have very, very different demographic profiles. And this helps contribute to the changes in attitudes that we've just seen. Not only that, but the two parties are well sorted geographically. Joe Biden won the election. He won by a very substantial margin in the popular vote, but still, remember, 49% of the people voted against him. It was a clear victory, but hardly a landslide in the popular vote. However, at the county level, very different. Even though it was reasonably close nationwide, if you look at individual counties, the link isn't working, but if you look at individual counties, very different. The example I like to give is Los Angeles County, overwhelmingly Democratic, and you could shoot a cannon down Wilshire Boulevard and not hit a Republican. By the same token, there are many counties in the United States that are just as overwhelmingly Republican. So many places in the United States, Joe Biden won by a landslide margin. Many places, Donald Trump won by a landslide margin. And if you live in one of those places, you sort of wonder, hey, how on earth could the other guy have gotten so many votes? Everybody I look at voted for my guy. And that in turn contributes to the level of partisan hostility that we've seen. So I want to leave lots of time for Q&A. So let me finish with this very relevant and very pertinent quotation from Abraham Lincoln from his first inaugural. We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. And he concludes by talking about the better angels of our nature. And maybe we'll see a resurgence of those better angels in the days ahead, but we've seen something very different in recent years, and that difference is something we'll talk about with our grandchildren. And with that, I will stop sharing screen and happy to take questions.
Great. Thank you, Professor Pitney. Feel free to, in the participant section, to raise your hand. You can address Professor Pitney directly. Otherwise, I have some questions in the chat that I will go through. The first, Jack, if you could comment on the Lincoln Project and where do you think they will go from here? And maybe I'll ask you to kind of include late night in that as well. You know, Jimmy Kimmel, Stephen Colbert have really seen the ratings rise in part because of this Trump and Trumpism. So, and Lincoln Project kind of plays into that as well.
Sure. Full disclosure, I was a member of the California Board of Advisors to the Lincoln Project. Lincoln Project is a group of political consultants, mostly Republicans and former Republicans. One of them, Steve Schmidt, just went over to the Democratic Party, but most of them are either Republicans or Republican identifiers. In 2020, they ran a series of ads, mostly online, some broadcast, to do two different things. First, to create a permission ramp for old-fashioned Republicans to split off and cast a vote for Joe Biden. These were all anti-Trump Republicans involved in this, and they wanted to just tip enough Republicans in close states to put those into the Biden camp. And they probably had some success. If you look at the state of Arizona, very close race, may have had some impact on voters there. But the other thing they were trying to do is just get in Trump's head. They had a bunch of online messages that tried to create suspicion in Trump's head about the people around him. They deliberately ran ads on the Fox affiliate in Washington, D.C., knowing that Trump would see them. Not that it would reach a large fraction of the American public, simply they had an audience of one. And it worked like a son of a gun. They were directly responsible for Trump firing his campaign manager, Brad Parscale, because they ran ads about all the money that Brad Parscale was wasting and putting into his own pocket, and Parscale was gone. And recently they helped fuel Trump's suspicions about Mike Pence. So in that extent, they were very successful. They were less successful in some of the races for the US Senate. They went strong after Susan Collins. That didn't work. Her opponent won. But when it came to the presidential race, they probably had some marginal impact.
Thank you. Kathy has raised her hand. Kathy, if you want to unmute yourself and ask your question, go ahead.
Hello. So my question, this is kind of related to the Lincoln Project, is do you think that Trump is a conservative? I know that he was able to get several, 3 conservative Supreme Court justices through. He lowered taxes, but didn't pay for it. But it seems to me like he really isn't a classic conservative. And when people say they support Trump because they're conservatives, sometimes I feel like that's kind of confusing. So that's my question. And then I'm going to show you here before, there's the baby.
Oh. Okay, there's the star of the show right there. Okay, I think that's a very good question. And the short answer is Trump really doesn't have a lot of beliefs. There are only a couple of issues that Trump really has anything remotely related to a conviction on. One of them is trade protectionism. He has consistently been a trade protectionist. And that, of course, is directly contrary to what the Republican Party has stood for, at least since the Reagan era. When it comes to fiscal conservatism, well, just look at the federal debt. That is not somebody who has any great concern about restraining spending of the federal government. So I don't think he has any ideology at all. He has latched on to ideas when he thought that they would bring him support. But when it comes to policy, just there's not a lot of there. The question is, how did he get his way with Congress so often? And the answer is, and Matt Grossman, I don't know if Matt's on this call, has had some very perceptive writing on this. And it's not so much that Trump had his way with the Republicans in Congress, but on a lot of issues, it was the other way around. Trump had a couple of things he cared about. Building the wall, that was another one. Trade protectionism. And, oh, by the way, if you want to understand about the wall, read Mike Shear's book. Okay, try to plug as many.
Thank you.
Trying to plug as many CMC books as possible. When it came to taxes, the Republicans in Congress did not need Trump to bully them into supporting tax cuts. They were down with tax cuts right from the start. And there's a fellow from the Western New York, Christopher Collins, who later was convicted on insider trading and pardoned by Trump. And he explained that his major contributors were saying, get this tax cut done or don't bother calling me again. So that was the real pressure on the tax cuts. It wasn't so much Trump. It was the contributor base of the Republican Party that was pushing that. So no, it's you can't really explain Trump in terms of any kind of coherent ideology at all, but rather that for him the Republican Party was just a vehicle for his own desire to hold office.
So we had a question come in asking if you think the Republican Party as we know it is dead. The Republican Party of George W. Bush, H.W. Bush, McCain. Seems like Mitt Romney is the only one still holding on.
Yeah, it's kind of like reminds me of the Dead Parrot sketch. It's kind of hard to see the Republican Party coming back to the days of George H.W. Bush. Just look at the vote in the House of Representatives on counting the electoral votes. And I have to say, even a lot of Republicans who I thought a few years ago might be figures of restraint on Trump have not been. Marco Rubio being prominent among them. What follows, I don't know. Will Republicans have an incentive to go back to the pre-Trump era? It's kind of hard to tell. I kind of doubt it because of primary voters. Republicans aren't so much devoted to Trump's ideology as they are scared of the people who vote in Republican primaries. And as long as they tend to support Trumpism, then Republicans are going to feel obligated to go in that direction.
One more question before we go to Raphael, who raised his hand. The senators and the congressmen and women who challenged the electoral results. There are a few senators that stood out amongst others. What do you think will happen with those senators and congresspeople long term?
In the long term, I think most of them are in districts that won't hold it against them. Being this is CMC, we like to talk about gerrymandering, and in some places that is definitely part of the equation. But a lot of it is simply what I suggested earlier, the sorting of the parties. There are some areas in the country that are very heavily Democratic, others heavily Republican. So even if we had a redistricting reform, it wouldn't make as much difference as people think. So for a lot of these folks, they can continue in the House of Representatives as long as they want because they have electorates that are willing to tolerate that kind of attitude. Now, Senate races could be a little different. In particular, somebody like Josh Hawley is going to have a good deal of trouble raising money because a lot of people have cut them off. But again, when it comes to the House, the realistic answer is they probably aren't going to pay much of a price.
Raphael, if you want to go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi. Yes. So I'm wondering, do you think there's going to be another autopsy report for the Republican Party? And, I know that there's been a trend to either change registration to, decline a state or join the Democratic Party. But do we think that there might be a better answer of just kind of, maybe an autopsy report and rejoining the Republican Party and kind of trying to reclaim it?
Very good question. For the time being, probably not. Let me explain for people who aren't familiar with the term. After the 2012 election, the chair of the Republican National Committee was Reince Priebus, and he commissioned a report on why the Republicans lost, and they concluded Republicans had to do more outreach, build the base of the party. And Priebus, as you know, went over to Trump to be his chief of staff, one of his chiefs of staff, thereby confirming what Rick Wilson wrote, everything Trump touches dies. Priebus did not have a good end in that job. And the current chair of the Republican National Committee is Ronna Romney McDaniel, and she is so devoted to Trump that she dropped the Romney part of her name, and is very much a supporter of Trump's. And there's no chance, so long as she is the head of the party, that there's going to be any official autopsy report. There may be the equivalent on the part of people like the Lincoln Project or think tanks like the Niskanen Center, but anything from the party is just not going to happen. Now, mind you, this doesn't necessarily translate to the state level. There may be some states in which you get some very different kinds of Republicans being elected as governor. You got Larry Hogan in Maryland, Charlie Baker in Massachusetts. Here in California, even though he nominally endorsed Trump, Kevin Faulconer is somebody from the more traditional wing of the Republican Party, somebody you could have imagined running for office in the 80s or 90s. But the question is, could even someone like that survive in California? That's very much an open question. So yes, I think there ought to be an autopsy report. Will there be? That is much more questionable.
Where do you think Trump goes from here? Trump news, does he fade away? Does he continue in politics? What do you think he does next?
He has to make a lot of money fast, because he's not nearly as rich as he claims. Again, read Dave Enrich's book. But also, he is going to be spending the rest of his life in court. Number one, he may well, even aside from the Senate trial, he may well face criminal prosecution in the state of New York for possible tax evasion, in the state of Georgia for interfering with the electoral count. The audio that we all heard is called to Raffensperger. That could lead to criminal prosecution. He may well be prosecuted in other states as well, because there are lots of ambitious Democratic district attorneys out there who would love to get a piece of him. Not to mention all the civil litigation that will, in terms of federal prosecution. Remember, he's individual one, named in the Michael Cohen case. Michael Cohen went to prison for following Donald Trump's orders. And Donald Trump could very well be indicted by that, for that. And in response to Mike Shear's chat question, yes, the student body is much more democratic than it was in your day.
All right, lots of questions have come in, so we've got a lot to talk about. Next question, do you think that our democracy can or cannot survive convicting a president responsible for what happened on January 6th?
He'll survive either way. You know, if Trump is convicted, it just means the short-term effect, he's disqualified for running for office in the future. The political effects of that, hard to gauge. I think the democracy will stand. Interesting question, if he is not convicted. Again, I think that the system will persist. The interesting question is what would have happened if he had won the election. That's a fascinating counterfactual, particularly if he had won the election and if the Republicans had done just a little bit better in elections for the House of Representatives. Remember, they actually picked up seats when most people, myself included, expected that they would lose some. If they had done a little bit better, they would have picked up the House of Representatives, and with a Republican House, who knows what he would have been able to get away with. But I think with the current lineup, I think democracy is in better shape than it was a few months ago.
Holly from Santa Barbara confirmed that wanted to confirm that you said 57% of Republicans are non-educated whites, and that is differed from the 1990s. Why such a shift? How has that changed, if that is in fact true?
Excellent question. Time was, and when I first started talking about public opinion polls, it was very different. That not much of direct correlation between education and partisanship. In fact, if anything, college-educated white people tended to be a little more Republican, in part because of income. In the past couple of decades, there has been a bifurcation. There's been a great migration of college-educated white people toward the Democratic Party, away from the Republican Party. There's a great senior thesis to be written about that. Some of it is the perceived anti-intellectualism of the Republican Party. Some of it is economic interest. People in the professions see that they have an economic interest in the policies of the Democratic Party as opposed to those of the Republican Party. I would be happy to be corrected if people have additional research on that point, but that seems to be the most plausible explanation. But very, very different demographics in the two parties. Obviously, there are some African Americans and Latinos in the Republican Party. Mike Garcia, congressman not far from here, was a very strong recruit for the Republicans. But generally, about 90% or more of African Americans vote Democratic, about 60, 70% of Latinos vote Democratic, and similar proportions of Asian Americans vote Democratic.
We have a couple more questions, and then we'll go to Jibin, who raised his hand. A couple people have asked about pardons. Talk to us a little bit about the pardons that Trump put in place over the last couple of months, and also why there was no pardoning for himself and or his family.
Yeah, very unusual. Usually, number one, this is not the first time that there have been pardons of friends and political supporters. There were some in the Clinton administration. Clinton pardoned his brother, Roger Clinton, who had a drug conviction in his past. There have been other pardons of some politically connected people, but the scale of the politically connected pardons is unprecedented. And in the past, you had most of the pardons were people who say had a wildly disproportionate penalty for possession of small amounts of drugs. Very few of the Trump pardons were like that. Most of them were people who were Trump supporters, had some kind of connection to Trump, had some kind of business connection to Trump. I actually know one of the pardoned people, Paul Erickson, who was the boyfriend of Maria Butina, who was the Russian agent who infiltrated the National Rifle Association. He was actually convicted on an unrelated charge dealing with some very shady financial dealings. Paul was in the very first class I ever taught anywhere when I was a graduate student. And somewhere along the way, he took a very wrong turn. But anyway, he was a big Republican supporter. So the question is, why didn't Trump pardon himself and his family? And part of the reason is the impeachment. Because if he had pardoned himself and his family, that would have vastly increased the chances that, number one, that the Senate would convict him. That would be a bridge too far, even for Senate Republicans. So in that sense, the impeachment has already had the effect that the Democrats wanted. And you could say, well played, Nancy Pelosi. Also, Trump is still liable to prosecution at the state level. I mentioned district attorneys. If Trump pardoned himself on the federal level, that would also greatly increase the chances that somebody like Cy Vance, the district attorney of Manhattan, or Letitia James, the attorney general of New York, would feel tremendous pressure to go after him at the state level and try to get a conviction that lands him in prison. So I think that pressure shifted him away from the self-pardon, which would have been constitutionally dubious in the first place.
Jim, if you'd like to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Sure, I'd like to tackle two things. First of all, I'd like to plug Professor Pitney's book.
You're muted, Jibin. Unmute yourself.
Sorry about that. I put in the chat a link to Professor Pitney's book, Un-American, The Fake Patriotism of Donald J. Trump. I would love to get this signed at some point in the future, but my question is actually, I kind of followed your personal, I know you publicly stated that you left the Republican Party, and I followed kind of a similar path. I was a registered Republican when I became naturalized in 2000, and the day after Trump was elected in 2016, I actually left and I joined the Libertarian Party, but I didn't really feel comfortable with some of the characters in the Libertarian Party, advocating for free ponies for everybody. And, when Andrew Yang was a candidate in the Democrat Party, I didn't necessarily agree with everything that he said, but I joined the Democrat Party specifically to vote for him in the primaries in California, even though he had dropped out by that point. But then I don't really feel comfortable in the Democrat Party either. So I've become a declined to state voter. So I've been a Republican, Libertarian, Democrat, and declined to state in the past 4 years. What's your advice for someone like me that can't find a political party? Do you see an emergence of another party at some point, maybe not in the near future, but maybe like 10 years from now? Justin Amash, more of a kind of a libertarian conservative. Do you see any figures coming up? Do you see any impetus for another party, another alternative?
Yeah, that's a great question. I had exactly the same dilemma. I'm still a declined to state voter myself. I thought about voting for Gary Johnson in 2016, but it turns out he's in business, and his comments during the campaign indicated that he was getting high on his own supply. So not the most serious candidate in the world. And I think you're right. However, there are some libertarians. Is Peter Caltagirone on the? Well, he's a libertarian. He's in Alaska, so he could end up being a leader of that in the future. If Peter ever runs for something, I'm totally down with him, just as much as I was for Steve Bullock in the last election. From my perspective, there are two parties. There are my former students and everybody else. So if any of you guys run for office, I'm behind you.
It does segue into several questions we've had, Jack, about third parties. Will new parties be created, perhaps a party of Trump? What is the likelihood of a third party candidate being elected to that kind of higher office?
Really, really hard. And again, something I talk a lot about in my parties class, really hard to get a new party going, ballot access, campaign finance. Realistically, the only way you could do it is if you had somebody who basically would take a billionaire. Michael Bloomberg wanted to start a third party. He might be able to do it. I mean, he's one of the few people in politics who actually has the resources to fund a party and make a go of it. But really, really hard given all of the institutional barriers to creation of a third party. Much more difficult than it was, say, in the 19th century. So I think that's extremely unlikely.
All right. I know we are running out of time and we have so many questions, so my apologies. One did come in asking about higher ed and CMC, so I think, Jack, it'll be appropriate to end there. How should an institution of thought or education, like CMC, navigate the current tendency to bully or cancel speakers that hold conservative views?
Well, I think I think it's important to be exposed to a wide variety of views. When I taught Gov 20 last semester, one student asked, "Well, what's my advice for reading?" And I said, "Read outside your comfort zone. Read outside your comfort zone. Invite speakers outside your comfort zone. Go to to people who are outside of your comfort zone." And I gotta say, this is part of our DNA at CMC. And I go back to Jack Stark, and I can't tell Jack how grateful I am to him for helping create and sustain that culture at CMC. And I hope it's something that we can hold on to and maintain as we go forward.
All right, Professor Pitney, thank you so much as always. There are so many questions still. You'll have to come back. I hope you will consider it. Maybe when we approach towards the end of President Biden's first 100 days, we can do a retrospective or something if you're willing. Everyone, thank you so much. We will put this up probably on Monday, the recording. We hope you are all well. Hope to see you next week for our virtual engagement programs. Feel free to unmute, say hello, and thank you to Professor Pitney. Have a great weekend, everybody. Be well.
Thank you. This was great.
Thank you.
Happy New
Thank
Year.
you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Thanks so
Thank you.
much.
So much.